We looked at a variety of ways in which Hobbes's answer to the question what kind of society we should have are still influential, even though his particular conclusion that we should have a totalitarian dictatorship isn't so influential. This time we'll continue looking at ways in which Hobbes' answer to the question, what kind of society should we have, are influential. There are a variety of ways in which the United States makes it hard to change its leaders. And here again, it's different from many, many countries. So for example, in Canada, if you want to change the prime minister, you just call for an election. You don't have regularly scheduled elections. Instead, you call for an election whenever you want one. So when people are sufficiently dissatisfied with the current leadership, they call for an election and we have a new election. In the United States, you can only get an election every 4 years. It's actually really hard to lose after 4 years. If you look across our history, not many people, at least in the recent past, do lose after 4 years. But we do have the opportunity to vote people out every 4 years. But in the interim, there's not much opportunity by way of opportunity to change the leader. Now, you might point out that a president can be kicked out of office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, but that doesn't really happen. So Andrew Johnson was impeached but acquitted. Richard Nixon was impeached and probably would have been convicted but resigned when he realized he would be convicted. Bill Clinton was impeached but acquitted, and Donald Trump was impeached but acquitted. Okay. Another element of our society, and this isn't uniform across people, of course, but many people agree with Hobbes, that you should identify the law with morality. This is clear in the popularity of political realism in foreign policy. That's a case where you have an explicit identification of law with morality, and enforceable law being the crucial thing. So there is no enforceable law in international affairs. So there is no real law. So you should just pursue the national interest because there is no morality. People who have a strong opposition to civil disobedience are often people who identify law with morality. They think it doesn't make any sense to say you're opposing an immoral law because laws can't be moral, or laws are by definition moral. Another way in which our society or certain aspects of our society are very Hobbesian is there's a tendency towards elite rule. So political leaders in our society are typically chosen from the elites. This is clear if you look at, for example, the fact that the median net worth for members of Congress is right around $1 million, whereas the median net worth for U.S. households is about a tenth of that. And about 25% of U.S. households have a net worth of under $13,000. The last 5 presidents of the United States have had degrees from an Ivy League school. There's also commonplace arguments for elite rule throughout U.S. history. So it's not just like accidentally you get most members of Congress being rich or something like that, or it's not like it's a side effect that everybody laments, that everybody says, yeah, it ends up being the case that most members of Congress are chosen from the elites, but it would be nice if it would be different. Some people say that, but lots of people say, no, we should have elite rule. And in fact, many of the so-called founding fathers argued explicitly for elite rule. So this is James Madison, early president, played a crucial role in developing the U.S. Constitution. He says that he fears greatly that a faction would take over the United States. And what faction is concerning him? It's the majority who own no land. So he's like, look, basically the idea was this. There's widespread calls for agrarian reform when this country is being founded. What is agrarian reform? Well, you had a huge amount of land owned by a very small number of people. And the land was worked or farmed by people who didn't own it. And the people who didn't own it wanted to own it. They wanted that land turned over to them. And this call for agrarian reform became very strong after the Revolutionary War. Because they were like, look, we fought this war because we thought we were going to get property rights. We were going to get rights to this property that we were working. And Madison and others were like, who were big landowners, didn't want any parts of that. And they feared that this faction, which is the majority who own no land, are going to use democratic principles to call for abolition of debts, for equal division of property, and all sorts of other improper and wicked projects. This is a quote from Madison. And in order to avoid that, Madison said the United States Senate, should be built so as to protect the minority of the super rich, the opulent, against the majority of the not so rich. So this is an explicit argument for elite rule. Now, to be clear, Madison wasn't some evil man rubbing his hands together trying to think like, how can I screw everybody else out of their stuff and keep everything for myself? That's not it at all. When you look into what why he thought these things, what he thought was ordinary folk are too stupid to manage their affairs properly. So if we just give equal division of labor, if I just turn over my farm to everybody who works it, like I turn over one portion of my farm to, the family farming that portion, and another portion of my farm to the family farming that portion, and so on and so forth, it's going to end up being horrible because these people are too dumb to manage the farm themselves, and they won't do it effectively, and there won't be enough food, and everybody's going to starve. So we need someone smart like me managing this huge portion of land and telling these people what to do. They're not going to let me tell them what to do if they own the land themselves, so I need to retain ownership. So the idea behind these people pushing for elite rule isn't like, at least not explicitly, that they just want power for themselves. It's rather that they think society will crumble if you don't have elite rule. And perhaps surprisingly, Alexander Hamilton had this kind of view. I say perhaps surprisingly because if you're familiar with the musical, then you know that Alexander Hamilton himself had very he came from poverty. He came from what people call humble beginnings. Nonetheless, he too argued for elite rule. So Hamilton argued that the few who are rich and well-born should have a distinct and permanent share in the government in order to help check the imprudence of democracy without having the rich and well-born having a permanent share of the government. He said, the masses of people who seldom judge or determine right would lead us to our own demise. They would destroy society. And again, he was worried about things like agrarian reform. Okay, so there's all these different elements that are of U.S. society that are very Hobbesian. Continuing with elite rule, there's widespread lying by government and corporate officials to the public on the ground that the ruling should be left to the elite, and that allowing the public to get involved would just make things too confused. Because if they learned various truths about what the government's doing in their own interest, they won't like them, they won't recognize that it's in their own interest, and they'll interfere in a way that will screw everything up. And you can see this play out in a variety of ways. An example, a clear case example related to the Snowden case, prior to Snowden's leaking of the documents that he leaked, which showed that the U.S. government was, in fact, intentionally trying to collect all U.S. Domestic U.S. citizens' electronic communications. A few months prior to that, James Clapper was questioned by a senator named Ron Wyden. James Clapper was the head of the National Intelligence Director or NSA Director or something. And he was asked, look, does the U.S. try and collect widespread information from U.S. citizens? And he said no. And Wyden was asking him this question because Wyden, as a government insider, long-standing member of the Intelligence Committee, knew that this was going on. So he thought, Clapper would admit it and say yes. But Clapper just lied through his teeth and said no. And when Clapper got caught, after Snowden leaked the documents, it was clear that Clapper had lied to Congress. He issued an apology, and his apology said this. He said, I can't figure out what could have been going through my head when I said that the U.S. government doesn't do this. This is obvious nonsense, right? He was lying. He knows he was lying. It's obviously not true that he just couldn't, who knows what was going on in his mind at the time. I can't figure out what I could have been thinking. He knows exactly what he was thinking. What he was thinking was these programs are classified. They're classified for good reason because if people knew about them, they would be mad. They might even oppose them, but we need these programs to ensure security. So I'm going to lie and say there aren't these programs in order to ensure that we keep them and we remain secure. That was Clapper's thinking. And that's an example of supporting elite rule. Clapper thinks, I'm in a position to make these decisions. Ordinary folk are not in a position to make these decisions. So we need to keep the truth from ordinary folk and have the hard job of governing be done by the elites. Okay, so coming back to where we left off, Hobbes' answer to this first question, why should we have some government rather than none at all, is still a popular answer. It's because we should have we need government to ensure that contracts are maintained. There's kind of a social contract that we make for how to treat one another, for example, not to kill each other. And we need government to define that contract and to uphold the contract to ensure that it's enforced. Hobbes' answer to the second question, what kind of government should we have, is not so popular. Most people don't think we should have a totalitarian dictatorship. But the answer remains important because many elements of Hobbes' answer, or to put it another way, many aspects of the argument that led Hobbes to his answer are still very influential. And we just looked at some of the ways that those answers are still influential in the United States. Okay, we'll stop there.